Lamar, having seen the Minneapolis Lakers move out to Los Angeles and keep their name, was originally very, very determined that the team would keep its nickname and therefore be the Kansas City Texans. To his credit, Lamar's general manager, Jack Stedman, who was not really a football guy, was more of a business guy, an oil guy, did have the good sense to somewhat sternly and somewhat stubbornly tell Lamar, you cannot move a franchise to Kansas City, Missouri, and call it the Kansas City Texans. So they had a newspaper name that team contest, and the Kansas City Chiefs became the new nickname for the franchise.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is Tim Hanlon, and this is, indeed, Good Seats Still Available, the podcast that is curious in its search for stories and insights and all kinds of fun stuff around teams and leagues that don't exist anymore. For whatever reasons, we pursue such. Thank you again for joining us, and we're in for a treat today. My guest is author extraordinaire, sports historian, if you will, Michael MacCambridge. We are going to be talking about Lamar Hunt, the patron saint of the old American Football League, the AFL, a major contributor to the modern day NFL that we know and love and enjoy today. And his books about Lamar, and as well as just the history of American football, are both extremely relevant and very relevatory, as you'll see in a couple of minutes when we get into our conversation with Michael. Michael MacCambridge has got a breadth of stuff out there, but there are two books in particular that I encourage my listeners to get copies of and devour as I have. Lamar Hunt, A Life in Sports, which came out in 2012, which was the original impetus of my reach out to Michael. But back in 2004, Michael also authored the book called America's Game, the epic story of how pro football captured a nation. You're going to hear both books basically referenced in today's chat for those completists out there who want to delve even deeper into the story of both the AFL and Lamar Hunt. Obviously, those stories quite intertwined. I highly encourage both of those books. Now, for those sports historians out there who are especially persnickety, you know that Lamar Hunt was not just confined to AFL football, but also things like professional soccer. The evolution of Major League Soccer would not be made possible without Lamar Hunt's past exploits, and in particular, his yeoman-like work with the Dallas Tornado and the original North American Soccer League. My hope is to get Michael back for conversation around that particular part of Lamar Hunt's history and background. But for today, it's the AFL and the Kansas City Chiefs, which, you know, really didn't start as the Kansas City Chiefs. And the beginning part of this interview got snipped off a little bit by some technical glitch. But I started off our conversation with Michael asking him to basically put things in context where Lamar Hunt's head was at, his career was at in the late 1950s, circa 1957, actually, before he really even became sort of this saint, if you will, in professional sports. And here's how we started that conversation.
In 1958, Lamar Hunt is working at his father's oil company. His father was the legendary Texas billionaire H.L. Hunt, and Lamar was sort of the most mild-mannered, most introverted of H.L. Hunt's sons, and was working rather aimlessly and rather dispassionately at Hunt Oil Company. What he really was a serious, true believer sports fan. And he was down at the Southwest Conference basketball tournament in Houston the week after Christmas in 1958. And before he went to one of the games, he was sitting in his hotel room on the foot of the bed watching the 1958 NFL title game, the legendary overtime game, a.k.a. the greatest game ever played, between the Colts and the Giants. And Lamar had always known he wanted to own a sports team. He was blessed with the means to do that, but he couldn't decide whether it was baseball or football. But he said that sitting on that bed, watching that great overtime game, that clinched it. Football had been his first love. football was what he knew best, and he decided he wanted to own a football team. And he also recalled sitting there and thinking, and it plays so well on TV, and not really appreciating how important that was at the time. So for much of 1959, Lamar tried to get a franchise, acquire a franchise, buy a franchise, and move a franchise, or get an expansion franchise in the NFL. But the 12 owners in the NFL had survived the Depression. They'd survived the player shortage in World War II. They'd survived a challenge from the All-American Football Conference. And they really were not interested in expanding. They really were not interested in sharing the pie. They really were not interested in moving a franchise to Dallas. So they turned him down left and right. The only real opportunity he had to acquire a team was the Chicago Cardinals, who were the second team in the Chicago market, owned by a man, owned by Walter Wolfner and Violet Wolfner, who had been the widow of Charles Bidwell, the original Cardinals owner. And Lamar made several efforts to try to get the Cardinals, but Wolfner was not selling. And at one point,
Michael,
he said,
why was the Cardinals the highest on his list to pursue versus other franchises?
Because they were sort of the redheaded stepchild in Chicago, because you had the Bears and the Cardinals competing for the Chicago market. They were, because of Bidwell's death, they did not belong to football people per se. And so they were a team that could either move or be sold. And for the NFL, there was a real challenge with the Chicago market, because with two Chicago teams, and remember, this is at a time where home games were blacked out, there was always a Chicago team at home. And so they could never broadcast any games when either the Bears or Cardinals were playing that day. So the NFL really wasn't taking full advantage of the Chicago television market. Yeah. And so all of those factors made, if you were going to get a team, it was going to be Chicago. Yeah. And Lamar made several passes at that. Finally, he visited Wolfner down in Miami, where he had some horse racing concerns. And Wolfner said, I'm not going to sell. I'm not going to sell control. I've got all these people who are interested in a team. There's this guy, Bud Adams, who wants to buy down in Houston. There's a guy in Denver. There's some people in Minneapolis, but I'm just not going to sell. And so Lamar shook his hand, got on a flight back to Dallas, and he said that on the plane flying back to Dallas, the light bulb went on in his head. And it was, in essence, this: I want to have a new team. All these other people want to have a new team, but the NFL is not open to that. So why don't I simply start a new football league? Which you would have to be really young and really naive and really audacious and also really well off to come up with that as a solution. But Lamar did. He was so energized by it. He asked the flight attendant for some stationery, and that stationery appears at the Pro Football Hall of Fame and in the Chiefs Hall of Honor now. Copies of that, reproductions of that. He sketched out the idea for a new league on the flight from Miami back to Dallas. This is in 1959, and then he spent the next several months just doing research on the feasibility of this, asking around, finding more information, tracking down the other likely investors. And in early August of 59, he announced that this new league, which they would call the American Football League, would launch in the fall of 1960. And he then began recruiting other owners: Bud Adams in Houston, Barron Hilton out in Los Angeles with the Chargers, franchise in Oakland, the franchise in Denver, which became the Broncos, and one of the charter franchises was in Minneapolis.
Yeah, let's talk about Minneapolis for a second, because that's a very interesting story in and of itself, because Max Winter obviously was part of the original cabal that Hunt was sort of trying to get together, but it's also indicative of what the NFL basically started to do in sort of semi-retaliation, if not outright.
Oh, I think you could call it outright retaliation. I think once the NFL owners realized just how serious this undertaking was, they immediately started sabotaging the efforts, and they went through the front door and through the back door. Their efforts to go through the front door were simply that they made repeated offers to Lamar and Bud Adams and a handful of other owners that if they would drop this American Football League, they would get expansion franchises in the NFL, which is, of course, what Lamar wanted in the first place. But to his credit, he said if he couldn't get all 8 owners, he'd given them their word. If he couldn't get all 8 owners in the new league in the NFL, he was not going to defect. So that failed. So then later in August, George Halas and Art Rooney Sr. Had a press conference down in Houston where they were holding an exhibition game and announced that the NFL had decided to expand, and they were going to put franchises in, of all places, Dallas and Houston. So that was not a coincidence. That was the NFL's declaration of war. The funding for the Houston franchise fell through, but the Dallas franchise was going strong.
But Max Winter
before we get to Minneapolis,
oh sure,
there was one other event that occurred, and that was in October of 1959. The commissioner of the NFL, Bert Bell, died of a heart attack while at a Philadelphia Eagles-Pittsburgh Steelers game. So suddenly you had this sort of benign figure of Bell, who had been very friendly with Hunt and it sort of served as an intermediary, is now no longer on the scene. And there is this void at the top of the NFL because it takes them a long time to find a new commissioner. And now everything is going on back channels. George Halas and some others are trying to manipulate the situation and essentially to kill the AFL in its infancy. So one of the things they do when the Houston franchise falls through is they reach out to Max Winter and the Minneapolis ownership group and essentially say, we are going to offer you an expansion franchise in the NFL. If you don't take that offer, we are going to get somebody else to put a franchise in Minneapolis, and you're going to be competing with the NFL. And so the same weekend of the very first AFL draft held in November of 1959, the news comes out that Minnesota has secretly accepted this bid to be in the NFL. And the story has been told and embroidered and augmented over the years, but the essence of the story is the AFL owners are sitting in a conference room in Minneapolis, and one of the owners, Harry Wismer of the New York Titans, the very well-known announcer, comes in with the next morning's newspaper and announces to the other AFL owners that this is the Last Supper, and then he points to Max Winter and identifies Max Winter as Judas, and then slams the newspaper down on the conference table, and suddenly the AFL is dealing with this signal betrayal. Minneapolis indeed did defect to the NFL. So Winter and his group wound up getting an expansion franchise in the NFL. Clint Murkison got the Dallas franchise in the NFL. And the Dallas franchise started in 1960. The Minneapolis franchise started in 1961. And that was sort of the body blow that the AFL took even before it had been born. To fill in the gap of the missing Minneapolis franchise, the AFL put a franchise in Oakland, which also offered Barron Hilton and the Chargers a natural rival and another West Coast team. So then suddenly the first year of the AFL had franchises in Los Angeles, Oakland, Denver, and Dallas. That was your Western Division. And then Houston, Buffalo, New York, and Boston. That was your Eastern Division. And that was what the AFL was up against. And as we got through to the beginning of 1960, and this is where also Lamar shaped the future of pro football, the only way the league was really going to be able to survive was to get a TV deal. And the revolutionary thing that Lamar sketched out on the stationery in that flight in 1959 to Dallas was that rather than each of the 8 teams going and negotiating its own TV deal, which was what was happening in the NFL at that time, the league itself would negotiate on behalf of all 8 of its franchises to sign a joint television deal with a network. And that deal was negotiated by an agent for MCA, the talent agency, an agent for MCA named Jay Michaels. His son Al is Al Michaels of Sunday Night Football.
There you go. And that was with ABC.
That deal was negotiated with ABC, and that was a crucial deal because even in the first year of the contract, there were AFL teams that were starting from scratch, had never existed before, that were making more money in their TV deal than certain franchises in the NFL. So that was the key to getting the AFL off the ground.
Was there any love lost between, I got to suspect there was, between Hunt and Winter, since that Winter was basically the first sort of defector, even before the league got off the ground?
Well, I'm sure that Lamar held a bit of a grudge, but to his credit, and this is sort of typical of who he was, each team to buy a franchise in the AFL had to pay $25,000. But after Minneapolis defected, Lamar thought that the gentlemanly thing to do was return the $25,000 for the Minneapolis franchise. At the same time, I'll tell you later, which is sort of the end of this story, about when Lamar saw Max Winter 10 years later in the elevator before Super Bowl IV, which coincidentally found Lamar's team, the Kansas City Chiefs, who had moved from Dallas after the 62 season and were now the Kansas City Chiefs, against Max Winter's team, the Minnesota Vikings, in Super Bowl IV. That's a great story.
We will get back to that. But you're now
foreshadowing,
foreboding, hopefully not. But it certainly was a fairly inauspicious start, right? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, one of the co-owners of the Raiders had dubbed this sort of merry band of men the Foolish Club for the amount of money and the undertaking that they were about to pursue. Can you sort of give us a bit of a sense of how Hunt sort of kind of, dealt with the immediate setback and with ABC contract in hand, get this thing off the ground?
Well, I think that it was actually a couple years down the line before the Raiders co-owner Wayne Valley decided that the league should be known as the Foolish Club. But of course, the problem was you suddenly went from having 12 professional football teams to overnight the market for pro football nearly doubling. Suddenly you had 21 pro football teams in 1960. The 12 in the AFL plus their expansion team that they added in Dallas, and 8 entirely new franchises in the AFL. And the Dallas Texans, Lamar's team, even though they had a great deal of money to sign players, and even though they had a very aggressive advertising campaign and an owner with deep pockets, which not all of the AFL teams had, lost nearly $1 million their first year. Second year was, if anything, worse. Some teams suffered attendance declines. And after that second year, the owners were going around and talking about what they'd lost. And, this franchise lost $600,000. I think the Texans lost $400,000. Another franchise lost $1 million. And Valley was reputed to say, you guys sound like you're proud of this. We can't keep doing this. we should call ourselves the Foolish Club. And Lamar was so pleased with that, and had that sort of Pollyanna mindset that always, when given lemons, tried to come up with lemonade. He sent out a Christmas card the following year to all the owners with a portrait of them, and dubbed them the Foolish Club, and the name stuck. I think a couple key things happened that allowed the AFL to survive. One of them was at the end of the 1962 season, the Dallas Texans, Lamar's team, played the Houston Oilers, who'd won the first 2 AFL titles in the 62 AFL title game. And they had an epic game, which at that time was the longest pro football game ever played. It went to the 6th quarter before the Texans won on a late field goal. That game was watched by something like 40 million people across the country, and it really was the AFL's coming of age as a football league. Shortly after that game, in which the Texans won, and so Lamar Hunt, who founded the league, finally had a champion. He made the very difficult decision to move the team from his hometown of Dallas to Kansas City. But it was a crucial move because the Texans had been hemorrhaging money. They'd lost $1.5 million their first 2 seasons in Dallas, and there was no real hope for a big change in the future. They'd lost $500,000 even after winning the league title because they were competing with the established NFL, and the Cowboys also had deep pockets, and Dallas wasn't really a big enough market to support 2 pro football teams. So he moved the team to Kansas City, started making money his first season in Kansas City. A year later, the New York Titans, which at that point was one of the shakiest, if not the shakiest franchise in the AFL, went into receivership. Harry Wismer couldn't really afford it. But Sonny Werblin of MCA, who had been instrumental in help negotiating that first TV deal, bought the Titans, took them out of receivership, and injected them with a sort of first-class ownership, marketing, business plan, moved the team into the new Shea Stadium, where they averaged like 50,000 fans a year the year before Joe Namath arrived. And then, of course, Werblin famously signed Joe Namath to that eye-popping $427,000 contract, which, as the saying goes, back in 1965 was a lot of money. So that was important. It also allowed the presence of Hunt in Kansas City and Werblin in New York with the renamed Jets, allowed the AFL to negotiate a huge TV deal in 1964 with NBC that would actually narrow the gap. By that point, NFL had its own joint deal with CBS, and they just re-upped for a huge amount of money, like $1.4 million per team per year. But the AFL was able to negotiate a deal that got their teams nearly $1 million a year and put them closer to being on equal footing with the NFL. And it was after that deal that Art Rooney of the Steelers, upon getting the news, said to another NFL owner, well, they don't have to call us Mr. anymore. It was at that point that it became clear that the AFL was in it to stay. And one other point on this, I'm sorry, ask a question and you get a plot.
No, I love it. Keep going. This is great stuff.
I don't mean to be so long-winded in my answers.
But I love all of it.
The other thing that was I think crucially important was the cities that the AFL went into: Buffalo, Denver, Houston, San Diego eventually, because after 1 year the Los Angeles Chargers moved to San Diego, Oakland, Kansas City starting in '63. These were cities in many cases that did not have a Major League Baseball franchise, and they were starving to be considered Major League. And pro football was one way that they were viewed as Major League. And so what you see in looking at a Denver, a San Diego, a Kansas City, a Buffalo, were cities in which the teams developed a real loyal, strong following very early in their existence, and that helped build that connection between these new teams that were created out of whole cloth and their fan base, and it really solidified after a few years the AFL's ability to perform well at the box office. And so you began seeing sellout crowds in Kansas City. You began seeing sellout crowds in New York, in Denver. And that also, in addition to the TV deal, helped create this authentic chemistry, this authentic enthusiasm. And then you had this other aspect, which was that because the AFL just needed players, they were able to sort of be more aggressive, a little less conservative by nature. That meant that the game itself, as it was played, was more wide open. There was more passing. But it also meant that the players they brought in, there weren't these unwritten rules that limited certain NFL teams to have fewer black players. They aggressively went after players from historically black colleges and universities. Mm-hmm. And so it was just this sense of the Wild West, this great wide open, this sense of a pure meritocracy. If you could make it, you got your shot. And so you had a situation in '63. The first player taken in the AFL draft was Junius Buck Buchanan. They were in Dallas when that draft was held, but he would start his career when the franchise had moved to Kansas City. There were more African-American players. There was more passing. There was more wide-open offense. You had these offensive masterminds, Sid Gilman, sort of the father of the modern passing game.
Sure.
Hank Stram, who was one of the innovators in multiple offenses, a lot of pre-snap shifts and motion. Al Davis and his notorious long passing game in Oakland. All of these things were going on at a time where the NFL was still very meat and potatoes. Vince Lombardi, 3 yards and a cloud of dust, the power sweep. There was a real difference in the sort of game that was played in the AFL and the sort of game that was played in the NFL. And the old line people in the NFL said, well, there's no defense in the AFL. They sort of looked down their nose on it. But the AFL played a very entertaining brand of football, and fans, and not just in the cities, but fans on TV across the country grew to love that game.
Do you, Michael? Do you have any sense as to why Kansas City was the place Lamar Hunt decided to move the Dallas franchise to?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. One of them was that Kansas City pursued Dallas very aggressively. The mayor, H. Roe Bartle, whose nickname, by the way, was Chief, sort of reached out to Lamar right after the '62 AFL title game, invited him up to Kansas City, said, we'll start our Chamber of Commerce will help start this season ticket drive. You can play at Municipal Stadium. We will build you a practice facility in Swope Park, and you guys will start on the good foot, and you won't have to compete with another pro football franchise. That was one reason. The other reason, though, that I spent some time writing about in both America's Game and in my biography of Lamar Hunt, was that New Orleans, which had reached out to Lamar earlier, New Orleans could not get a stadium deal. There were still problems with facilities being segregated in New Orleans. And so Kansas City made the more aggressive, more viable offer, and Lamar decided to move the franchise to Kansas City. And they already had, just moving to Kansas City their first year in '63, they had a greater season ticket base than anybody else in the AFL had, even though the AFL a 3-year head start. So Kansas City was very, very aggressive about getting the team that was renamed the Chiefs, partly after H. Roe Bartle. Although Lamar, having seen the Minneapolis Lakers move out to Los Angeles and keep their name, was originally very, very determined that the team would keep its nickname and therefore be the Kansas City Texans. To his credit, Lamar's general manager, Jack Stedman, who was not really a football guy, was more of a business guy, an oil guy, did have the good sense to somewhat sternly and somewhat stubbornly tell Lamar, you cannot move a franchise to Kansas City, Missouri, and call it the Kansas City Texans. So they had a newspaper name that team contest, and the Kansas City Chiefs became the new nickname for the franchise.
That's a hard to believe story. It's incredible. You wonder what was in his head when he was, thinking about the move to actually keep the name and to have to be talked out of it.
He loved being from Texas, and he'd gotten into football in the first place because he was a Texan who loved football, and he sort of had this thought that maybe it would go. Lamar would admit later that he was foolish and he was being stubborn, and renaming the team was very much the right thing to do.
So, come 1964-65, you're talking about now, I guess there was a new television contract, and the bidding wars kind of really started to sort of percolate in terms of player salaries and the like. And it seemed like the AFL was really not only on the rise, but potentially a major irritant to the NFL now after a couple of years under its belt, no?
I think there's no question about that. And I think that it's hard to overstate how much intrigue, how much animosity, how much behind-the-scenes spy versus spy type machinations were going on between the NFL and the AFL. The two leagues had sort of had this unwritten rule that they were not going to raid the other league for veteran players. So the battlefield was for players coming out of college, rookies. And so both leagues would hold drafts, and then it was great for the rookie football players because they were benefited from this bidding war. And both leagues went to extreme measures to try to induce players to come to their league. And this involved not just money, it involved women, alcohol, whatever it took, by any means necessary. When Tex Schramm, the president of the Dallas Cowboys, referred later in his life to the war in the 60s, he was not referring to Vietnam. He was referring to the battle between the National Football League and the American Football League. It got so elaborate at one point, that the NFL had a initiative that they referred to as Operation Handholding, also known as babysitters. And what they would do is they would go out and recruit incoming rookies before the draft, try to build a relationship with these rookies, and then they would swoop down the weekend of the draft and try to keep these players away from whoever the AFL representative was and get them to sign a deal before they could really even hear the pitch from the AFL. And the AFL responded with its own countermeasures. At one point in the middle of the decade, the NFL was holding this sort of for show draft at a hotel in New York with the press there, with team representatives there. But at another hotel, they were holding a secret draft behind closed doors and then telephoning the results of that draft to the show draft that the media was at. And it was that kind of very Machiavellian environment in which the two leagues were operating and spending a great deal of money. And I think that it's really ironic because you had interest in the two leagues increasing because you had this 12-month-a-year battle between the AFL and the NFL. On the other hand, the money that they were spending was threatening the very existence of teams in both leagues. The Chargers were in trouble. The Cardinals were in trouble. The Steelers were in trouble. The Raiders had to be bailed out at one point by Ralph Wilson, the owner of the Bills, just to make their payroll and stay alive. So it was a very difficult situation. And finally, early 1966, Tex Schramm of the Cowboys, who really disliked Lamar, partially because they were, for the first 3 seasons, both operating in the same market, decided that it had come time to try to reach a truce. So Tex reached out to his old friend Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the NFL, and Rozelle told him that he could make an effort to try to broker a deal. And Schramm called Lamar Hunt, asked him if they could have a meeting. Lamar was in Kansas City at the time, working on a season ticket drive, but he had to be down in Texas for an AFL owners meeting. And he flew into Dallas, got off the plane at Love Field, and he and Tex had this secret meeting spot under the statue of the Texas Ranger in the lobby of Dallas Love Field Airport. And Schramm was there to meet him. They went out and sat in Schramm's car, and that was when, this is April of 66, Schramm said we would be, under certain circumstances, interested in discussing a merger between the two leagues. And for the next 2 months, Schramm, representing the NFL, and Lamar, representing the AFL, carried on these secret negotiations, which ultimately led to the June 8, 1966 announcement that the NFL and the AFL were going to merge, and that following that 1966 season, the two leagues were going to play a championship game, the AFL-NFL championship game at a site to be determined. And it's, again, if you grew up after that time, it's hard to describe just how much of an unknown quantity that was, because no AFL team had ever played, practiced against, taken the same field, even scrimmaged against an NFL team. But after that 66 season, you had that first game where an NFL team, the NFL champion, was going to take the field against the AFL champion. And that game would come to be known, of course, as the Super Bowl. And it was Lamar, he's credited, correctly so, for giving the name to that game. But I think the thing that's lost there is, if it wasn't for Lamar and the AFL, there wouldn't have been such a game, because there wouldn't have been two leagues vying for the public dollar and public interest.
Well, you tell an anecdote in there about how the name Super Bowl probably came about, right? From Lamar's family? Yeah,
Lamar's kids had, the big item at that time in American popular culture was the Whammo Super Bowl. And Lamar's children each got a Super Bowl in that summer of 1966. And Lamar wrote a note to Pete Rozelle in which he said, "I think we should coin a phrase for this game. We should come up with a catchy title, such as," and he suggested, Super Bowl. And he sort of said it to Rozelle apologetically in this letter, and he allowed that he was sure that this committee on the merger could come up with a better name than that. But Super Bowl, of course, stuck. And that was what, even before the NFL started officially calling the game the Super Bowl, that was the name that newspaper headline writers started calling it. Rozelle didn't like the name. Rozelle thought the name was unsophisticated and had this golly gee whiz air to it. But even within NFL circles, when NFL Films did their first roll of film at that first AFL-NFL championship game, the sound man said, Super Bowl Reel 1. So it had sort of gotten this momentum on its own. Finally, by the time the third game was played, Rozelle surrendered because everybody was calling it Super Bowl, so there was no reason at that point not to adopt the name officially.
So before we go to the later years of the AFL and NFL's merger / coexistence, I want to go back to that sort of pivotal moment. I mean, you mentioned Schramm kind of being sort of the go-to, I guess, in reaching out to Hunt. Do you have any sense of whose idea that really was at the beginning? What was he doing Rozelle's bidding? Was it Schramm's kind of insistence or recognition? Did Hunt even maybe make some entreaties over the way?
There had been discussions of mergers since the AFL started, but the NFL was in the stronger position. There had been some discussions between Carol Rosenblum and some AFL owners a year earlier that led to nothing, because at the time, the NFL's sort of private position was, if we do merge, we are not going to take in the teams from with two markets, so that the Jets would not be able to stay in New York if there was going to be a merger. The Raiders would not be able to stay in the Bay Area if there was going to be a merger. By '66, when Schramm negotiated the deal, it became clear, and this was not Schramm's choosing, but it became clear that if the two leagues were going to merge and survive any antitrust challenges, that you were not going to be able to move the Jets, who by then had Namath and were already challenging the Giants in popularity in that very big market, and the Raiders, who under Al Davis had sort of established their own identity in the Bay Area market. You were not going to get those franchises to move. So then, as the negotiation was going on, what Schramm had to do was try to convince the San Francisco ownership and the New York Giants ownership to find some way to agree to this deal. Now, by the time we get to '66, Al Davis has been hired as the commissioner of the American Football League. The Giants have signed, for the first time ever, a veteran player from the other league, the kicker, Pete Gogolak. Mm-hmm. And that prompts Al Davis to direct this guerrilla war in which he starts trying to sign quarterbacks from the other league. So Roman Gabriel signs a contract with the Raiders. John Brody, the 49ers quarterback, signs this huge contract, which was written up literally on the back of a cocktail napkin, with the Oilers. So as this negotiation is going on and intensifying, the Giants, in response to the Jets having gotten Namath and being successful there, they say they want either the first pick in the draft or the ability to trade that pick for an established quarterback. The 49ers say they just want their damn quarterback, John Brody, back. And those are part of the agreements to bring about the AFL-NFL merger. There is a fee for the AFL franchises, but Lamar negotiates that the fee is amortized out over a number of years, and he has to talk the AFL owners into doing that. But Lamar very smartly recognizes that the value and the TV money for the AFL teams, the value is instantly going to increase. The TV money is going to quickly increase once the two leagues merge completely with the 1970 season. And so they negotiate and bring about this deal. And there is a very famous press conference with Rozelle in the center, Lamar on one side, Schramm on the other side, in June of 1966 in New York, where the merger is announced. And then, of course, you've got to get approval of this through Congress. And the key factor in gaining that approval is Russell Long from Louisiana needs an assurance that there's going to be an expansion franchise in New Orleans. And there is a quid pro quo that is pushed through. Long is able to get approval and antitrust protection for the merger of the two leagues in this bill, pulling an end around from the Representative Emmanuel Seller, who was opposed to it, and New Orleans gets its franchise. The NFL and the AFL merger is approved, and on January 15, 1967, the Green Bay Packers, champions of the NFL, take the field at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum against the Kansas City Chiefs, the champions of the AFL, in the very first Super Bowl. And what was interesting about, one of the many things that was interesting about that game was, in terms of the public interest for the game, they were fascinated with it, but it was a foregone conclusion that the Packers were going to dominate because they were from the more established league. They were Vince Lombardi coached. They had the best known team. They had won titles in the NFL now for 2 years running. It was sort of universally understood that the NFL was going to have the better league certainly for the time being. But at the same time, within the leagues themselves, there was a tremendous amount of tension and pressure. Frank Gifford, who by then was an announcer for CBS, said that down on the field, in the minutes before Super Bowl I, as he was doing a pregame interview with Lombardi was trembling because everything that Lombardi had accomplished with the Packers in the NFL would be for naught if they couldn't beat the upstart new league in that first Super Bowl.
Everything to lose.
And after that tough first half in which the Chiefs actually outgained the Packers and the score was close, 14-10, the Packers broke through in the second half, won the game 35-10. And the next day at the NFL meetings, when Lombardi walked in with the Packers ownership group, the other owners at the NFL stood up and gave Lombardi a standing ovation. Wellington Mara, the owner of the Giants, said that the mood for the first mixed party with owners from the AFL and NFL together that weekend, that the atmosphere at that was something akin to that aboard the USS Missouri. So there was some real tension, there was some genuine animosity, and there was some real pressure because those two leagues had not played before that first game.
Well, I was going to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but in those latter years, right, 68 through 70, until it was a fully accomplished merger, you had a couple of years there where you had, the leagues were essentially in parallel in sort of different sort of universes, yet they're conjoined by official merger agreement, right?
By the Super Bowl, and they played some preseason games, and the Chiefs, after they'd lost that first Super Bowl, were sort of the butt of a lot of jokes, a little bit like what happened to the Buffalo Bills when
Sure.
they lost 4 Super Bowls in a row, a little bit like what happened to the Denver Broncos when they got blown out by the 49ers in the Super Bowl. The Chiefs, in going into that 67 season, were roundly derided as the best of a Mickey Mouse league. But they had a preseason game that next summer of 67, in Kansas City against the Chicago Bears, who were still coached by George Halas, the very embodiment of the NFL. And that preseason game, the Chiefs just slaughtered the Bears. The score was 66-24. Dick Butkus in the fourth quarter of that game famously said to Len Dawson across the line of scrimmage, "Hey, let up. Not worried about me, but you're going to kill that horse you've got," because the Chiefs had a horse, war paint, that ran around the field after every touchdown. And by the time the score got up into the 60s, war paint had a pretty serious workout. There are Chiefs players I talked to as I was researching the book America's Game, because the Chiefs were one of the 6 franchises I focused on in that book, who said that of all their wins, Super Bowl IV, winning the AFL title in 66, winning the AFL title in 62, beating the Raiders to go to Super Bowl IV, that of all their wins, maybe that win over the Bears was in a way the most satisfying, even though it was an exhibition game, because it sort of staked this claim to, hey, we can play some football as well with this NFL franchise that was pretty decent, had Gale Sayers, Dick Butkus, was a credible franchise, and just wiped them off the field.
And then obviously the equality basically kicked in on Super Bowl III. We all know the Joe Namath legacy prediction of that game. But it seems to me that the AFL truly didn't go out with a whimper. They essentially lived on as the merger finally came together. I mean, you literally had a conference essentially that in modern day NFL was the result of the AFL's original team setup.
Yeah, and you have to go back and spend a little time talking about how important Super Bowl III and Super Bowl IV were, because I didn't know this when I started working on America's Game, but in my research, I saw that the weekend before Super Bowl III was played, down in Miami, Colts and Jets, Rozelle, at his annual State of the League press conference, said that after Super Bowl IV, they might change the format so that 2 NFL teams could play in the Super Bowl, because the conventional wisdom at the time was that it was going to be another decade before the AFL was going to be able to be on par with the NFL.
Interesting.
The Packers had won both of the first 2 Super Bowls going away. The Colts were like a 17 to 19 point favorite over the Jets going into Super Bowl III. And so the feeling was these Super Bowls weren't going to be very competitive for a while. Then, of course, Namath, the league's biggest star from the nation's biggest city, goes on the biggest stage and predicts and then delivers the biggest upset in pro football history. There were people who were in shock after that 3rd Super Bowl. People who, not just with the Colts, but people with the league, who needed to be consoled, who were in tears. And I think it's significant, as I went back and read the newspapers and magazines from that period, that going into Super Bowl IV, there were a lot of NFL loyalists who still didn't take the AFL seriously, who said that if the Jets and Colts had played 10 times, the Colts were going to win 9 of those games, and who, because of that, felt as though the Vikings were going to slaughter the Chiefs. The Vikings were 2 touchdown plus favorites over the Chiefs in Super Bowl IV, which brings us back to Lamar and Max Winter as we start tying this up.
Good callback. Very good callback.
They were at the same hotel, and so Lamar and his wife Norma were kind of late getting started to get to Tulane Stadium for the Super Bowl. They stopped in their room. They'd had some breakfast luncheon. They stopped in their room, got all they needed, got their coats, and they get on the elevator. And as the elevator doors open and they get on, there's only two other people on the elevator. And it's Max Winter and his wife, the Vikings owner, co-owner, and his wife. And Lamar and Norma politely say hello to Max Winter and his wife, and they politely say hello back. And then they ride down to the lobby in silence. So they get off the lobby. The Winters go one way, the Hunts go the other way. As they're walking out to their car, Lamar says to Norma, "We're going to win today." And Norma's eyes widen and she looks back at him and she says, "How do you know?" And Lamar says, "Because they're even scareder than we are." He sensed how nervous and how tense and how uptight Winter was as the Vikings owner. And of course, the Chiefs go out. They thoroughly dominate the Vikings. They win 23-7 with a team that is the very epitome of the AFL. The first team in pro football in which a majority of the starters were African American, a team that is reflective of the innovation that Hank Stram brought, with lots of different formations, lots of pre-snap motion against Bud Grant, whose team, I believe, had no motion, no pre-snap shifts, and used only two formations the entire game. You get sort of the offense of the 60s as represented by the Vikings against the offense of the future as represented by the Chiefs. And they go out and they win. And now, after 4 Super Bowls, the NFL has won 2, the AFL has won 2, and they are on equal footing. And the American Football League, at that point, finally gets the respect that it's due. And at that same moment, the league ceases to exist. Because with the next season, 1970, you've got the full and complete merger. The AFL is no longer an entity. It's renamed the American Football Conference. It brings over 3 new teams. So instead of a 16-team NFL and a 10-team AFL, you have 2 13-team conferences, the National Football Conference and the American Football Conference, within the larger umbrella of the National Football League. And so the AFL is no more. And yet, what Lamar Hunt accomplished with the AFL was the first upstart league in American professional team sports to survive intact since the American League of Baseball Clubs started in 1901. So since 1901, the only upstart league in American professional team sports that has survived intact to challenge a more established league is the AFL. And all 8 franchises of the AFL survive today. And in fact, the 4 teams of the AFL West Division, that the 4 franchises that competed against each other in 1960, the Texans, who are now the Chiefs, the Chargers, the Raiders, the Broncos, that division has remained, those 4 teams have remained division rivals every year since 1960.
And the AFC trophy is named after Lamar Hunt himself.
And the AFC Championship trophy is named after Lamar Hunt himself. And the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that Lamar owned and is now owned by his children, have not ever won the Lamar Hunt trophy. And as I was working on America's Game, and I was talking to then the Chiefs GM, Carl Peterson, and the Chiefs coach, Dick Vermeil, as Lamar was aging, they would have tears in their eyes when they talked about how much they wanted to win the Lamar Hunt trophy and give that to the man it was named after. You know, we've seen a lot of championship droughts end. We've seen LeBron James bring a title to Cleveland. We've, of course, seen the Cubs and The Curse of the Billy Goat. And both of those were long droughts. It's not quite as long, but it's going to be pretty emotional the next time the Kansas City Chiefs get back to the Super Bowl, and in so doing, win the AFC title, and Clark Hunt gets to raise the trophy named after his father. That's going to be a special moment for a lot of people from Kansas City, and it will. The Chiefs still take the field wearing a patch with the old AFL logo on it, similar to the patch that the Chiefs wore in Super Bowl IV, honoring the 10-year anniversary of the AFL.
A couple of quick questions, Michael, before we wrap it up. And I can't thank you enough, because these have been fantastic stories about not only the AFL, but Hunt himself. I guess the one question I would
sorry to lay the filibuster on you. It's gone on. But,
my hope is that our listeners, and I'm sure there'll be a small in number to start, but hopefully grow over time and persistently will be discovered. We'll find this all very fascinating, and hopefully seek to find out more, not only in the book Lamar Hunt, A Life in Sports, which you wrote in 2012, but also the other book that you've referenced a couple of times during the course of this, America's Game, The Epic Story of How Pro Football Captured a Nation, from 2004. I would highly urge all of my listeners to get both of those books, because, and I have not read, I have to confess, I have not read America's Game, but I have read the Hunt book thoroughly. We are only scratching the surface. There's just an amazing amount of meticulous research and stories and anecdotes and just inside pieces of information that are just, I think, fascinating to anybody who's interested in sports history, but Hunt in particular in the AFL. I'm curious.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm curious as to how you thought. How do you think Hunt balanced this sort of dual a process of running a team in a fledgling league, as well as, oh yeah, by the way, running the fledgling league itself? Not an easy task, is it?
Well, he always tried to do what was best for the league, and he tended to think in terms of, and certainly this was the case with moving the franchise from Dallas to Kansas City. Certainly Hunt himself had the money, had the wherewithal to afford losing $500,000 or $1 million for many, many years in Dallas. But he recognized that the league was only as strong as its weakest franchise. And to have a team that was the sort of the second football team in a 2-football team market was not going to be good for the league, for the league's standing, for the league's prestige. And so he made that sacrifice and moved the team to Kansas City, to the eternal betterment of the city of Kansas City, Missouri. So I think that was important. He recognized that for the league to succeed, it needed to have 8 strong franchises, and he worked to make that happen. And he certainly welcomed and recognized very soon that Sonny Werblin was going to do the same thing in New York, turning a weak franchise into a much stronger one by taking over the Titans and in the process renaming them the Jets.
Do you ever think that Hunt really kind of knew that this was ultimately going to happen if he just stuck to it and got this league sort of to a viable, if not competitive level with the NFL? Did he kind of see that vision that ultimately this kind of merger and outcome would happen?
I think so. I also think Hunt was deceptively tough. He was very mild-mannered. He was very polite, very affable. And I think some of the NFL owners took that as a sign of weakness or softness, just sort of saw him as this callow youth. But he was determined to succeed, and he was a principled man. He had a chance, as I said earlier, to get what he'd wanted in the first place, which was an expansion NFL franchise in Dallas. But by that time, he'd started the AFL. He'd made a commitment to the other 7 owners of the AFL. And so he stood his ground. And because of that, pro football was able to expand rapidly. and interest in pro football expanded rapidly. A lot of other innovations that the AFL brought to the fore are part of the game today. Names on the backs of players' jerseys started in the American Football League. The two-point conversion famously started in the American Football League.
Sure.
Those innovations were significant and helped make the game more watchable in the 60s. And by the end of the 60s, pro football had eclipsed baseball and had become America's most popular sport. That would not have happened as quickly. It certainly was probably going to happen, but it, no question, would not have happened as quickly if it wasn't for Lamar Hunt starting the AFL.
And last question would be, what were your impressions in all your research, in both of these books, about Hunt before your research and your writing and afterwards? Was there something that you were unaware of, or that became, related to you, or you discovered, or maybe changed your opinion about the man from what maybe you thought he was before the process of this book and this research began?
I think the big thing was seeing the resilience, seeing the persistence, seeing the tenacity. When he set his mind to something, he was highly determined, and he just was not going to give up easily. And that sense of determination was crucial to the AFL's survival. The other thing on a more personal level was, they say certain people are most at home when they're with their family. Certain people are most at home, most comfortable when they're alone. I always got the sense that Lamar felt uncomfortable about being the son of the richest man in the world. Was certainly an inversion of every stereotype of what a rich Texas oil billionaire would be. He didn't go for the 10-gallon hats. He didn't go for the big belt buckles. He didn't go for all the bluster. I felt like Lamar was most comfortable when he was just another face in the crowd at a sports event. And he loved going to, there are stories of him, not just in football, but baseball, hockey, soccer, which was his second love, getting on a plane and flying halfway across the country just to see a game. He once, on a weekend when he was courting his wife Norma, they saw 5 football games in one weekend. One Friday night at the Cotton Bowl, SMU Navy. Saturday at the Cotton Bowl, Texas OU. Then they went and saw a game Saturday night down in Waco, Baylor, Arkansas. Flew up to Kansas City and saw the Chiefs play on a Sunday. Flew back down to his hometown of Dallas and saw a game between historically black colleges and universities, Prairie View A&M and another school, on Monday night. And as they were coming home from that, he said to Norma, "We saw a Fipple header this weekend." Lamar loved being in the crowd and loved watching games.
And she was probably canonized as a saint the following weekend, if I'm not mistaken.
And Norma, I believe, is still the only woman who's been to each and every Super Bowl. I think she holds her streak. She loves sports as well.
I can't imagine she had a choice by marrying into the Hunt family and Lamar. Michael?
Well, I think one of the things that caused him to fall in love with her was she already loved sports, so that was important.
So no conversion necessary.
Right.
So, Michael, I gotta thank you, and I reserve the right to try the second half of the story on the soccer front, because I think there's a whole bunch of very interesting and probably even less known stories about Lamar's interest in soccer, especially the old North American Soccer League. Hopefully for another day. But I do want to remind our listeners that there are two specific books here, and again, Michael MacCambridge has been the guest, but he's also a prolific writer. He's written a lot of very interesting books in and around the sports history genre. But America's Game, his 2004 book called America's Game: The Epic Story of How Pro Football Captured a Nation, essentially is kind of almost a treasure trove of history about how, and you heard some elements in this conversation, pro football became what pro football is today. And there's no doubt that the 2012 book, Lamar Hunt, A Life in Sports, is a deep dive, and I think, frankly, the essential read about the life and times of this man who essentially helped birth not only the AFL, but frankly, modern day football himself. And now that said, Michael, I do have to sort of regale you one little piece of trivia from my end.
Okay.
Not that it matters to you, but you are backhandedly the inspiration for this podcast, which I know you now have to be sitting down to take. But so 10 years ago, I started to sort of rattle around in my brain what I could do to sort of scratch this itch about teams and leagues and defunctness, if you will, in sports. And the book that I saw in the bookstore that just spoke to me, which is also a fine book authored by our guest, Michael MacCambridge, called the ESPN College Football Encyclopedia. And if you've ever stumbled across this book, it's the Bible, I guess, right, of college football. It's statistics, but it's also well designed and laid out. And I actually reached out to a woman by the name of, you may not know her, Ellen Scordato at Stone Song
designed
Press.
The book. She was wonderful.
Correct. And I, here I was, just this little advertising executive, in New York on a regular basis, doing my sort of professional thing. And I made contact with Ellen, and I sort of regaled to her with this idea of like, there should be an encyclopedia for all these great teams and leagues and stories and vignettes, et cetera, helmets and, color swatches and all that kind of stuff. And I still hold on to that dream someday, but 10 years on, I just think that the quickest way to start getting some of these stories out now is in the audio method. But, your work on that book is inspirational, I think, for a lot of folks. And it continues to be, I think, one of probably the best sort of, I don't even want to call it a reference book, but it is very Bible-like in its oversight of the college football genre, and it does have a lasting effect. And I think perhaps someday.
Well, thank you.
I thank you for the inspiration. Ironically,
I think that there will probably not anytime soon be another book like that, because it was published just at the point that people were starting to get that information on the internet, and more of that information was becoming available on the internet. So there's not really a financial model for publishing a 1,600-page book with 25 different writers and a cast of thousands of designers and statisticians. And that was kind of, the last chopper out of Saigon for big sports reference books for the time being. But I was very proud of that, and I think that that book still holds up well. I wanted that book as when I pitched it to ESPN. I said nobody has done a good college football encyclopedia in decades and decades, and I want to do this differently. I want this to be a reference book that people will actually want to sit down and read. And I think that we succeeded on those terms.
It holds up. And, I highly encourage anybody who's a big college football fan should put that on their library shelf and keep that and savor it, because it's fantastic work. But no less, a denigration for any of your other work. And I can't thank you enough for your time and regaling us with some stories about the AFL, Lamar Hunt, and I'll keep my fingers crossed that we could do it again sometime.
Would love to, and good luck with the podcast.
I will certainly let you know how it goes, and let you know when it's up and running, and give it a couple of weeks, and I look forward to socializing it and sharing it, and hopefully getting you a few more library purchases, from the back library, as well as maybe your current book too about Chuck Noll. You want to tell us 1 second about Chuck Noll, the book that you wrote about him, which is currently out?
Yeah, the most recent book is called Chuck Noll, His Life's Work. It's available on Amazon and at finer bookstores near you, if there are any bookstores left near you. And it came out in the fall of 2016, and it will be out in the paperback version will be out in the fall of 2017.
Congratulations!
But I spent 3 years writing about the life of one of pro football's most successful coaches, but also one of the least known giants in football in the past 50 years. So it was a fascinating, challenging process, but I enjoyed it.
And you also did quickly mention something in email that you may have something around 1970s sports maybe rattling around your brain?
Maybe. Still haven't figured out what's coming next. At some point in the future, I will, I believe, write a book about how the decade of the 70s transformed sports in American culture. I don't know if I'm ready to undertake that just yet. Have some other irons in the fire and trying to figure out what to do next. But at some point, I do hope to write that book.
I do know a podcast
and that book is all about, there's a lot in that book that would be about upstart leagues and the ABA and the World Hockey Association and World Team Tennis and the International Volleyball Association and all of those various and sundry fly-by-night outfits, including the World Football League.
Oh, yes.
And the notion that there was a time in American history where it seemed entirely logical for someone launching a new football league to have a pigskin in the shade of butterscotch with burnt orange stripes. There was a week in the 1970s where that seemed like a logical thing to do. So that was certainly an interesting decade in American history and certainly in American sports history.
Be careful. Gary Davidson is still with us, and I intend to get him on this podcast, and you have stumbled into my thicket. So I can't wait to talk to you about that book, maybe during the process as well.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Michael. I look forward to it.
Thanks much.
Take care, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, so there is our conversation with Michael MacCambridge, and probably a little bit more than you wanted to know. The sort of backhanded, ironic inspiration, I guess, for this podcast from one of his works, and that work, which we just talked about, is still out there, and it is a really cool presentation of sports information, the ESPN College Football Encyclopedia. I know that there are copies of that still out there, and it's a great reference piece, and it doesn't feel like a reference piece. It's something that you can look at and go to on a regular basis, and perhaps someday, knock on wood, we'll try to put something similar to that for our realm of defunct sports franchises and leagues and teams, perhaps from some of the stories that we elicit in this podcast. Someday down the road, perhaps can convince Michael, if he's not retired and living on a beach somewhere, to maybe help us in that effort. But in the meantime, I do, besides that book, recommend highly two of the books that were referenced during the course of our conversation. One, again, is Lamar Hunt, A Life in Sports. That's published by Andrews McMeel. That came out in 2012. And then in 2004, his book, America's Game, The Epic Story of How Pro Football Captured a Nation, which is published by Random House. Michael also has a book currently out on the life and times of legendary Pittsburgh Steelers head coach Chuck Noll. It's called Chuck Noll, His Life's Work. That came out in October of 2016. All of those books available wherever fine publications are sold, Amazon and the like. We have a link to those works and others available on our website, which, as a reminder, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. Please follow us on social media and let other people know that you like what you're hearing. Maybe they can check it out as well. On Twitter, that's at goodseatsstill. You can find us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable. We also have a Facebook page about Good Seats still available as well, and all that good stuff. So thank you again for listening. We look forward to many, many more interesting and fascinating conversations coming up. So you have plenty to look forward to, and we thank you for listening. And we'll see you on the next show. Take care. Bye-bye.